Stargate, a novel by Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich. Chapter 1. 8000 BC. All that remained was the eye of the beast, and when that was done, it would see him, it would live. The animal's hide was painted orange and black, the hooves and horns scratched onto the wall with chalk. The image was crude, but it captured the gazelle's panic, the terror of being hunted. The mouth screaming, the torso twisted in flight, the legs clattering for a way to escape. The boy had camouflaged his dark skin with stripes and odd symbols, using the same paint he had used to conjure the gazelle. In the cave's murky light, he dipped the hollow end of a long stick into a bowl of ink, then approached the wall. He looked up and into another eye, a white human eye, painted like a religious icon, high on the wall of the cave. He began the hunt by speaking the name of the animal he was about to stalk, Cat. With that signal, the old man standing at the mouth of the cave sat down in the scratched gravel and began to chant. The old one, clad in animal skins and wearing a long beard, was the leader of his clan and the boy's teacher. His chanting was a slow, rhythmic hunter's song spoken in the language of the gazelle, the song the tribe always murmur-sang while hunting. The boy ground the hollow stick into the empty eye socket of the animal, then put his lips to the end and blew the ink out of the stick to create the animal's eye. Under the spell of the old one's soft chanting, the boy felt the animal slowly coming to life. Soon he and the gazelle would see one another. The hunter could move no faster than the stone walls of the cave that surrounded him, or he risked alarming the animal and ruining that part of the hunt happening at the same moment out in the valley. The boy never felt himself move, but by continuous force of concentration found himself advancing upon his prey. This same technique was being used by the hunters in the field. The best of them were called those who walk without being seen, and they formed an elite group within the tribe. Their symbol was the white disembodied eye, painted like a religious icon high above the gazelle. These elite hunters were amazed and intimidated by this 10-year-old boy's incredible patience during the hunt, and his ability to control the minds of the animals. It was just one more strange thing about this remarkable child, one more reason to fear him. On the surface, the boy appeared catatonic, asleep on his feet. There was no indication of the intense mental struggle being waged. The painted animal was constantly on the verge of flight. It felt the boy coming too close, almost close enough to grab him. The boy could feel the animal's every impulse, every thought, but he showed her nothing, remaining absolutely calm. The hunters of the tribe spent their whole lives learning how to conceal their fear and excitement from the animals at close range. When this magic came naturally to the boy, both in the field and up in the cave, the people said that he must have been born without a heart. In fact, the child had rarely displayed any emotion at all. No anger, no fear, no love. When he crept within arm's reach of the gazelle, he heard the old one's chant slow even further, becoming a hallucinatory drone. Steadily, the boy inched his wiry black arms above his head. In one hand he held a chisel, in the other a heavy hammering stone. Then, without any visible signal, the old one and the boy suddenly shouted the name of the animal at the same time. Cat! In a lightning-fast attack, the boy brought the chisel to the wall, then crushed down with a stone to cut a deep gash into the painted wall. The fresh scar ran straight into the heart of the gazelle. A moment later, the old man stood up and entered the cave, to inspect the young one's work. He could see that the hunt in the field would be successful. Pleased and excited, he looked into the boy's unique eyes, a mixture of brown and amber yellow, then raised his staff above his head in salute, speaking the boy's name. Ra! At the mouth of the cave, the boy sat in the sun, watching the old one pick his way down the rocky trail, then out across the desert floor to where the tribe had established its camp. An afternoon fire had been made, and he watched the plume of smoke rise into the breeze, where it shredded and disappeared. Soon the hunter's horns were heard in the distance, and he watched the children of the camp sprint out to meet the returning heroes. When they came to the top of the last dune, he saw they were carrying a pair of gazelles tied at the feet to 2 long poles, which the men carried on their shoulders. When the old one saw what they had brought, he raised his staff high above his head and shouted his praise. The hunters returned the gesture, and then the entire tribe turned to face the cave, dug into the side of the hill. As one, they saluted the odd young hunter with the brown amber eyes. The boy coolly returned their signal. That night, after their tribe had feasted, the hunters began their dance around the central fire. They wore hollowed-out wooden masks, eerie helmets, painted to resemble the animals of their world: the hippopotamus, the jackal, the bull, the hawk, the gazelle. As always, the boy kept his distance from the others. He found a large, smooth rock well away from the fire and sat there observing the ritual dispassionately. He noted how frightened everyone became when confronted by one of the animal masks. Each time one of the dancers broke away from the fire and shook his head at the onlookers, everyone, not only the children, jumped backward and shrieked with fear. At one point, the jackal-headed dancer broke through the ring of spectators, sending them squealing in all directions. He danced out to the rock where the boy was sitting, planning to bring him into the celebration by giving him a good scare. The dancer shook his head and made a series of grunting noises, but nothing made the boy so much as flinch. Looking through the open mouth of the mask, the man looked into the boy's eyes. A moment later, it was the adult hunter and not the child who became frightened. Stumbling backward, he retreated to the fire and the ring of other dancers. Although everyone witnessed the incident, no one regarded it as particularly strange. In their turn, all the members of the tribe had gone to the boy, attempting to coax him into the group's common life. Many of them had come away from the encounter in fear. For his part, the boy felt no particular malice toward these people. He occasionally felt something like gratitude, even though he knew they had discussed killing him more than once in order to put the mothers at ease. He regarded them as a simpler species, and although he didn't know where he would go, he knew that he was destined to become one of those rare people the tribe encountered from time to time, individuals who lived apart from any group. While the heat and noise of their fire dance continued, a mysterious event took place, unnoticed by any member of the tribe. The moon was full that night, turning yellow and dying into the horizon. On a quieter night in the camp, someone would have seen the large triangular shape gliding through the sky, casting a weird, straight-edged shadow across the top half of the full moon. It hung there for a moment, blotting out the moonlight before sliding away into the blackened night sky. Sensing the disturbance, the boy turned to look behind him, but by then the shadow had gone. Hours later, as the camp slept, this same silent shadow circled past the moon once more. Something was hovering over the camp, watching, waiting. Only a pack of jackals, always alert to being hunted, noticed. They bayed and turned to run. The boy's eyes opened and fixed on the swaying bird skull fetish strung like a wind chime to the edge of his tent. An animal hide tied to a series of sticks that provided shade during the long, hot hours of the afternoon. An abnormal breeze rustled through the camp, then suddenly died. Curious, the boy sat up. Soon another gust rolled through. Only this one didn't die. It became a steady wind that slowly increased in strength. Within seconds it had become a gale, waking everyone in the camp. Stronger still, first one tent and then another collapsed or was lifted away in the wind. Now the Old One was on his feet, moving through the camp and shouting above the storm, ordering a retreat to the cave on the hill. A dazzling light appeared from above. A square beam as radiant as the sun shone down on the desert floor just north of the camp. As it slowly plowed toward them, the tribe's people scattered, terrified, away from the light. The Old One, a commanding presence, stood his ground and ushered all those he could find away from the light, toward the mountain. The boy's first impulse was to obey the man and go with the others. But then, curiously, he calmly turned and began to walk directly toward the light. It was as though he had no will of his own. The Old One ordered him to safety, but the boy marched on. Through the chaos of the wind and light, out to the rim of the camp, he was inextricably drawn toward it, called by an irresistible force. He looked directly into the blinding white light glaring down from above, and as he reached a hand up into the light, something touched his hand. Soft and warm, this bright presence quickly wrapped itself around him, engulfing the boy in its brilliance, submerging into his skin, into his soul. He felt, perhaps for the first time, an emotion he could neither hide nor control. It was excitement. The excitement that comes with a sense of deliverance. The excitement it is only natural to feel when your destiny is announcing itself. Chapter 2. Cairo, 1928. On the ramshackle outskirts of Cairo, from the minaret of the Jebel al-Salam Mosque, the muezzin's afternoon prayer call pealed out over the last rooftops of a city that had changed little in the last 2 centuries. A freshly polished 1924 Rolls-Royce Imperial touring sedan, property of the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, whizzed past the last buildings and out into the long, hard sand of the desert. Moving south along the highway to Giza, the car swerved around the occasional lorry full of workers or farm produce. Taylor's message, as welcome as it was, couldn't have been delivered at a worse moment. Professor Langford was midway through a meeting with the Egyptian Interior Minister. His Excellency was going on and on about the changing political climate, and how it would be a terrible personal risk for him to extend Langford's British-sponsored excavating permit. Langford, a Swede, had been in the country long enough to read between the lines of the minister's speech. He wanted cash, enough to compensate him for the grave personal risk he would be taking. Langford, who had become fairly adept in Arab negotiating technique, counterattacked immediately, making certain to act angrier than he actually was. He shouted about all the money he had spent and all the jobs he and his team had created. He stood up and pounded on the minister's giant cedar desk, reminding his plump, mustachioed friend of all the snags and broken promises he had endured in this most frustrating of countries. That's when the door opened and the note was delivered to Langford. The handwritten dispatch ended the meeting. "Langford, sitting down? We've got something. Probably a tomb. Too soon to tell. Excavation continuing. Very exciting. I suggest you get your aristocratic hind end out here at once, and don't bring any of those pudding heads from the ministry. Let's keep this quiet for as long as we can. Taylor." Refolding the letter, Langford cringed at his foreman's undiplomatic language. He knew that the note, which Taylor had neglected to seal, must have been read by at least 10 pairs of eyes before reaching him, and that the minister, at whom he was now smiling politely, would learn its entire contents within 10 minutes. He had to hurry. The way rumors spread in Cairo, if he wasn't quick, there would be a souvenir shop built at the edge of the dig site by evening. Excusing himself, he hustled downstairs and found the driver assigned to take him home. In his broken Arabic, he explained the new itinerary and that there would be a sizable tip for speedy driving. Within minutes, they had swung by the swank Shepherd's Hotel, picked up his brainy 9-year-old daughter Catherine, and were careening through the congested downtown toward the zoological gardens, scattering pedestrians as they went. Langford dug his fingers into the vehicle's velvet armrest and didn't breathe normally until they were well out of town on the southbound highway. Catherine, already a daredevil in pigtails, leaned through the sliding glass partition into the driver's compartment, practicing her Arabic with the driver and squealing at every near collision. She had arrived in Cairo 12 weeks before, called to join her father when an important discovery had seemed imminent. A prodigious learner, she had become something of an expert on hieroglyphs in that time, visiting the Egyptian Museum almost daily, annoying and charming the staff with hundreds of questions. In her braided hair and thick glasses, she looked destined to become a matronly bookworm. Once they were cruising along the highway, she settled back and cracked open a thick book entitled Ancient Egypt. In the back seat, suppressing his excitement with all the strength of his Victorian upbringing, Professor C.P. Langford, member of the Egypt Exploration Society and the British Royal Museum, looked every inch the gentleman archaeologist dressed, as he was, in puttees, khaki jodhpurs, and field jacket. Normally, he would never dress like this for actual field work and wished he could change before meeting Taylor and the others. He had only worn this costume to impress the Egyptian officials. Langford and Taylor met in Luxor in 1920 when both men were visiting Egypt for the first time. Langford, the aristocratic family man from posh London, and Taylor, the rough-and-tumble graduate student from the University of Pennsylvania, who had dropped out of school and volunteered to fight in the World War. After the armistice, he'd wired home for money, then spent some time touring Greece and Palestine before ending up in Egypt. In Luxor, Langford had naturally stayed at the luxurious Winter Palace. Taylor, constrained to a more modest budget, came there every afternoon, pretending to be a guest because the hotel had flush toilets and the International Herald Tribune. The two men spent several afternoons exploring Biban el-Maluk, the Valley of the Kings, with Taylor doing most of the talking. But it was their visit to the Temple of Tea, farther north, that cemented the partnership. Not far from the Great Pyramids, adjacent to the famous Steps Pyramid, stands the Temple of Tea, the only monument of grand scale erected in honor of a non-royal personage, overseer of the pyramids, scribe of the court, chief astronomer, and special advisor to a number of pharaohs. Tea was also known as Lord of the Secrets. They spent an entire week probing the tomb, discussing the many well-preserved reliefs and friezes that adorn the burial site. When Langford slipped the tomb's caretaker a little backsheesh, they were awarded access to a little-known collection of papyrus fragments unearthed by Mariette, the Frenchman who had excavated the tomb 45 years earlier. From these fragments, already ancient by the time T took custody of them, the men developed their present theory, that something was buried halfway between the Steps Pyramid and one of the great pyramids of Giza, probably Khufu's. The papyri referred to a plague or pestilence or demon that was stolen and ferried away. The clues were sparse, and the chances for success weren't good. If the good citizens of Stockholm, as enthralled as they were with the recent Tutankhamun discoveries, had realized what an incredibly long shot this excavation was, they never would have funded it. But fund it they did. When Langford returned to Cairo the previous March, he brought with him guarantees of nearly 1 million Swedish krona. After only 6 weeks of fieldwork, they discovered a small burial chamber. Langford, supposedly the diplomatic half of the team, rushed into town and invited all the foreign newspaper correspondents and several government dignitaries to witness the opening of the tomb. Even Howard Carter, the world's most famous archaeologist, took time off and made the trip from Luxor, where he was in his third year of cataloging the contents of Tutankhamun's small tomb. So, on a beautiful May morning, the entrance was cleared, and the two men crawled through the opening. It would be very interesting to have a record of their conversation inside. When they emerged, grinning and embarrassed, they carried with them the only artifact of any interest, a mummified cat, still in its crude wooden coffin. The international press had a field day. Long satirical articles appeared on the discovery of the kitty cat Tut, etc. It was a humbling, humiliating experience for Langford, who had imagined himself on the verge of lasting fame for his contributions to science. Cruising southbound with the green ribbon of the Nile on one side and the vast Sahara on the other, Langford couldn't help contemplating immortality once more. One never knew what one might find, but then the Great Pyramids, the only remaining wonder of the ancient world, came into view, and the gentleman archaeologist quickly regained his perspective. The overwhelming size of these structures on the Giza Plateau, the pyramids of Mycerinus and Chephren, and especially that of Khufu, made Langford laugh at himself. How pitifully insignificant his little project seemed in the shadows cast by these magnificent eternal works. But that was before he saw what he'd found. Before the tires stopped rolling, Langford's boots were crunching across the gravel, with Catherine fluttering behind. He climbed to the edge of a silt and stone plateau, many thousands of years old, but the plateau had been transformed, hollowed out by one bucket of earth at a time by the hundreds of Arab laborers the team had employed over the past few months. Now it was a small, shallow valley, littered with digging equipment and divided into nicely measured parcels by surveyors' stakes. Nearly 300 laborers, fellahin, were working that day. The great majority of them were local men dressed in hikes, long white cotton robes, and makeshift turbans. The bulk of activity was taking place at the far end of the site. Long fingers of dust spiraled into the breeze where the fellahin were dumping the excess sand and broken rock. As soon as these men emptied their baskets, they turned and headed back to a larger-than-normal hot pit. A pair of wooden hoisting cranes had been moved into place at the edge of the pit, and ropes were being strung through the pulleys. They were preparing to lift something out of the ground. Something heavy. "Daddy, the treasure's over there," Catherine informed him in Swedish, pointing toward the cranes and the crowd of workers. "We'll go see Ed Taylor first." Langford spotted Taylor and a group of other men bent over a work table outside the office tent. They seemed to be studying something. Langford, notorious for telling unfunny jokes in several languages, had been polishing a witticism for the last several minutes. When he came within shouting distance of the group, he tried his luck. "Ed, if we found a pet cemetery, I quit." Just as he feared, no one laughed. In fact, no one gave him even the faintest sort of courtesy chuckle. But what really struck Langford as odd was that none of the men even noticed his ridiculous gentleman explorer outfit. The group's intense concentration told Langford that this was no ordinary find. Both he and Catherine were immediately caught up in the drama. "We can't decipher his writing. Take a look." Taylor made room for Langford to step up and look at the large sheet of paper spread across the table. It was covered with a series of strange markings, charcoal rubbings taken from an etched stone surface. It only took Langford a few seconds to understand why the group was so perplexed, but to everyone's surprise, Catherine said it first. "Those aren't real hieroglyphics," she said in English. "At least not the kind we're used to." "Taylor," Langford said, suddenly edgy, "where did these symbols come from?" "I'll show you." The foreman strode off toward the dig site. 30 yards short of the pit, which was crowded with workers, all of them shouting instructions at one another, Taylor stopped at what appeared to be a gigantic stone tabletop. It was 3 feet tall and 20 feet across. The massive slab was the same chalky gray as the gravel it sat in. "It's a cover stone," Taylor explained. "The largest one I've ever seen. When you bury something with a rock this size, you mean to keep it buried." Langford excitedly walked around the perimeter of the stone, inspecting its engraved surface. This was truly a world-class find. Not only was the stone striking for its sheer size, but the sculpted surface was a stellar example of the ancient Egyptian stone carver's art. The face of the monolith was organized, like a target, into a series of concentric rings. The outermost ring contained 39 characters written in the strange language Taylor had showed him. Inside the next band, there were symbols that were clearly related to ancient Egyptian writing. They seemed to be an extremely early, extremely crude version of the later hieroglyphs. Next was a ring of strange arched lines crossing the surface of the stone in different directions. Some of the points where these lines intersected were marked while others were not. It looked like some ancient form of geometry, but it was the engraving in the very center that defined the stone as a masterpiece. Langford hopped up onto the stone for a better look at the centerpiece. Over a background of the precisely cut arching geometrical lines, there were symmetrical etchings of the goddess Nut. Arching her back to hold up the sky, she fed the children of earth from her breast, while they sailed beneath her in the boat of 1,000,000 years. Between these beautiful pictures, at the very center of the stone, was a cartouche in the classical style. Inside the oblong cartouche, a frame around a sacred name or word, were 6 of the strange hieroglyphs from the outermost ring. Did these characters spell the name of some prehistoric pharaoh? Was it some sort of message? "Very queer," muttered Langford, an accomplished student of Egyptian writing. He shook his head and came back out of the periphery of the ring, where he studied the second ring for a few moments before speaking to Taylor and the others. "This inside band is somewhat legible. This one here could be the symbol for years, 1,000 years, heaven, the stars, or something like that. Lives Ra, sun god. But what in the world do you make of these outer symbols?" As Langford bent down to study the signs, he asked himself the same question Taylor and the others had been pondering all afternoon. Have we found an undiscovered language? And if so, who were its authors? "What are these things over here?" called Catherine, rummaging through the neatly stacked collection of incidental finds, each one tagged, bagged, and catalogued. Taylor explained. "Those are little pieces of the tools and cups and things that the workmen used when they buried this stone. But look at this one," he said, holding up a gold medallion embossed with an udyat, a symbol that was half bird and half human eye. He handed it to Catherine. "This was wrapped in a piece of cloth and left on the center of the stone." "At last you've found something lovely," Catherine said, dazzled. "The Eye of Ra," Langford said, stepping down off the coverstone for a closer look at the design of the medallion. He turned it over in Catherine's hand before speaking to Taylor. "Very, very rare to find this motif on a piece of jewelry. Perhaps it belonged to a priest." Catherine held the find up to the light, admiring it until the men fell back into their conversation. She then unclasped her own necklace and slipped the medallion onto her chain. "Taylor, if this is a cover stone, what did you find buried underneath?" Just then a shout went up from the pit, and 200 workers began to pull the dozens of thick ropes strung through the pulleys. Langford wanted to move closer, but Taylor grabbed him by the sleeve and led him to the top of a small hillock to one side of the pit. "Trust me, we're in the best spot." Everyone in the dusty valley, from the most highly educated scientists to the poorest of day laborers, understood they were watching a singularly remarkable event, the excavation of Earth's strangest ever archaeological find. Responding to the foreman's rhythmic command, the fellaheen slowly pulled the ropes taut, lifting a giant quartz ring, more than 15 feet tall, up from its centuries-long sleep. Perfectly round in the lustrous color of pearls, it was an oversized, meticulously wrought jewel. The entire surface was etched and decorated in intricate detail, as complex as an electronic circuit board, as beautiful as a sultan's amulet. "It's one of God's bracelets," Catherine said excitedly to her father. In his decades of investigation and research, Langford had never seen anything like this. In spite of its design similarity to certain First Dynasty finds, it seemed impossible that ancient Egypt could have produced anything so technically advanced. 7 fist-sized quartz jewels were set into the ring at even distances, each one surrounded by a golden shroud. These shrouds were replicas of the striped pharaoh's headdress or nemes, like the one on Tutankhamun's famous death mask. Running along the inner edge of the ring were the same indecipherable hieroglyphs found on the coverstone. When the workmen had the ring standing at a 90-degree angle, they began to prop it up with a series of padded wooden poles. Taylor pulled the dumbstruck Langfords a few paces to the right. As the sun passed behind the ring, they were surprised to find that the material was semi-translucent. "What's it made of?" Taylor shrugged. "Beats me. It's harder than steel, but there's no oxidation or corrosion. Some type of quartz, but not one that I can identify." Langford turned back to the ring and stood there calmly for a moment before suddenly erupting in a giant roar of celebration. "We did it!" Catherine watched as her father, usually so stiff and formal, wrapped his surprised American partner, Taylor, in an exhilarated bear hug. The two of them broke into a wild, shouting celebration dance. Then something went wrong in the pit. The Fellahin were shouting and pointing at something. Then they began to abandon their work before the support poles were securely in place. The huge ring tottered dangerously, threatening to fall over and crush the crowd. Taylor ran toward the pit, shouting in Arabic. Langford turned to Catherine and commanded her sternly in Swedish, "You're not to move from this spot." She waited as long as she could, about 5 seconds, before chasing after him to investigate. The situation in the pit worsened to utter chaos within a matter of seconds. While scores of people were leaping in to man the ropes, scores more were fighting to get out. Everyone, it seemed, was shouting at the top of their lungs. A moment later, Catherine could see the problem. A section of the bedrock had split open, leaving a deep gash where one of the supporting poles had been anchored. She watched as Taylor and her father led the effort to re-secure the beam. Whatever was at the bottom of the freshly opened hole was sending a panic through all the Arabs who looked down at it. Catherine couldn't stand it any longer. She had to see. She hurried around to the far end of the pit and slithered down one of the walls. Her father and the other men were down in the dirt, working right beside the mysterious cavity. She climbed over the ring itself and came into the crowded circle of workmen at its center. She pushed her way between the men and peeked down into the hole. "Fossils!" "Catherine!" She heard the anger in her father's voice, but couldn't take her eyes off the freakishly twisted figures the earth had opened to reveal. Partially buried in the stone, the bones splintered as if crushed with great force, was a very human-looking hand, but next to it, flattened to sharp angles, was what looked like a large exoskeletal head. Definitely not human. The chilling thing was the shiny black almond-shaped eye staring out of the head. It could have been rotten biological tissue that had petrified, or a thick sliver of onyx set into a statue. Or perhaps the Fellahin were right. Over and over they used an Arabic word she recognized, the word for devil. Hypnotized by this mangled preview of hell, Catherine felt herself being lifted into the air, floating toward the edge of the pit. Her father plunked the girl down, gave her a long, hard stare that meant his patience was exhausted, then ordered one of his assistants, a rotund young man from Liverpool, to keep an eye on her. For several minutes, as the men worked to steady the ring in its upright position, she sat watching the last light of afternoon deepen into the violet evening. She stared up at the ring, strange desert jewel, and came to an irreversible decision. She promised herself, no matter how long it took, no matter how hard the job was, she was going to solve the mystery of where the ring had come from. She got to work immediately, running to her tubby escort and making an announcement. "I'm going back to the car." Sensing he had no choice in the matter, he followed her back to the limousine where she set to work thumbing through her copy of Ancient Egypt. Soon she found what she was looking for, a picture of the god Anubis, the jackal-headed deity responsible for shepherding the deceased down to the land of the dead. "Look at this," she said, passing him the open tome. "That smashed-up thing down there is Anubis. We've got to show this to my father." Her companion, who'd gotten only a quick glimpse at the carnage before he was conscripted into the role of babysitter, took the book and laid it across the hood of the car. As he was squinting at the page, another chauffeur-driven motorcar pulled up. Out stepped the Egyptian Undersecretary of the Ministry of Antiquities himself, coming to pay a routine visit. As the foppishly dressed mustachioed bureaucrat strolled past, surrounded by his entourage of flatterers, he tipped his hat to the little girl. "Good evening, Miss Langford. Has anything interesting happened today?"